dear students, myself Gangadhar Solanke, and I welcome you all to the MCGM's virtual classroom. My dear students, today in 9th Standards Political Science, we are going to start with the topic the United Nations. So, what are we going to learn in this chapter? The United Nations, an international organization, was established to ensure peace and security. So the basic and the first important thing which we have to understand here in this topic is that the United Nations is an international organization which was established to ensure peace and security at the international level. Try to understand this. In civics, we people learnt about the state government and central government, but this United Nations, which is an organization of the countries, that is why it is at the international level. So in this chapter we shall study its objectives, principles, structure and role in securing peace. Now if we people discuss about the background of the United Nations, then the thing which we know, two world wars were fought at the start of the 20th century, and because of these two world wars, life and property were destroyed on a large scale in these wars. Life and property were destroyed on a large scale in these wars, and because of this, the League of Nations was established after the First World War. After the First World War, League of Nations. The League of Nations was established after the First World War, and the United Nations, about which we are going to study in this topic. The United Nations was established after the Second World War out of a realization that there has to be a mechanism to establish world peace. So the basic thing behind the formation of or establishment of the League of Nations or the United Nations was to security and to maintain peace in the world. But after the use of the nuclear weapons in the Second World War, the idea took root that such destructive wars should be stopped, and that is the collective responsibility of all nations to do so. And the United Nations was established after the Second World War to instill this understanding among all nations that it is very important to stop such kind of wars. क्योंकि दिन ब दिन क्या हो रहा है, टेक्नोलॉजी जितनी एडवांस हो रही है, मॉडर्न हो रही है, वही टेक्नोलॉजी बहुत सारी मिलिट्री में भी यूज़ की जा रही है. तो उससे क्या होगा, फर्स्ट और सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर में लाइफ एंड प्रॉपर्टी का जो नुकसान हुआ है उससे कई ज़्यादा हो सकता है, एंड इट विल क्रिएट danger to the earth also. So it is very important to maintain peace in the world. Now here the chronology of the establishment of the United Nations. Key points are there on the screen. The Atlantic Treaty, which was signed between Prime Minister of England Sir Winston Churchill and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Second World War on 14th August 1941. So it was between the two nations, Prime Minister of England Sir Winston Churchill and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now according to this treaty, a decision was taken to set up to set up a permanent mechanism to establish international security. So it was the objective of that to establish international security after the Second World War was over. Now, detailed discussions followed on this decision into conferences among Allied powers in 1944 and in 1945, and a draft of the treaty to establish an international organization was prepared. Then after, at San Francisco in America, representatives of 50 countries, ये ऐसे 50 देश थे जिन्हें लगता था कि फिर से कोई वर्ल्ड वॉर ना हो और दुनिया के सामने और कोई बड़ा खतरा ना हो, तो ऐसे 50 देश सैन फ्रांसिस्को में इकट्ठा हुए, और वी कैन से द रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स ऑफ दैट 50 countries. And these 50 countries drafted the Charter of the United Nations after discussions. And as soon as the war got over, the Charter was signed on 24th October 1945. And the United Nations was established. So it was started where? 14th August 1941. And finally, जो establishment हुआ, that was on 24th October 1945. The United Nations is an international organization of sovereign nations. In detail about United Nations we'll talk, but here the objectives of the United Nations, which is the world's largest international organization. In the beginning, only 50 countries were members of the United Nations, but today this number has gone up to 193 countries. Now here in the United Nations membership from 1945 to 1994, you can see how it is increasing, the participation or the members. 1945, 48 up to 1993, and the number of nations increasing continuously. So today this number has gone up to 193. All these member nations come together on the platform of the United Nations, and the United Nations has its own definite objectives. Briefly, the United Nations takes up all necessary measures for establishing international peace. So peace is very important whenever we are talking about the United Nations. The basic objective or the fundamental thing about the United Nations is that it is for maintaining or for establishing international peace. Here now the objectives one by one. To establish friendly relations among nations without any kind of tension, without any kind of stress. It is very important to establish friendly relations. Then to enhance international security by solving international disputes. If there is any international dispute or international disputes, then by sitting together, by discussing on it, and by taking help of other nations, it is important to enhance international security by solving international disputes. To safeguard and foster human rights and freedom. So here one again very important thing about the United Nations, it is the organization which is not only working for the solving international disputes or establishing peace, but also it works for the safeguard and foster human rights and freedom of the common. Along with these, the United Nations also aim at enhancing economic cooperation at the international level. Here now on the screen, you can see the purposes of United Nations: to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate in solving international economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems, and in promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to protect earth and environment. Now, the principles of the United Nations: all member states have sovereign equality, all member states must obey the charter, it is compulsory. Countries must try to settle their differences by peaceful means. Countries must avoid using force or threatening to use force. This one is also very important when we talk about the establishment of peace. Countries must avoid using force or threatening to use force. The United Nations may not interfere in the domestic affairs of any country, because this one is only for the international purpose or international level. Countries should try to assist the United Nations. Now, the next point: principles of United Nations. All member nations will have the same status. This one is very important because it may possible that due to the thing of status or due to the status in the United Nations, again the problem may rise. So it is the thing that all member nations will have the same status. There is no discrimination among nations based on geographical size, economic, or military power. Now, where 193 members are there in the United Nations, तो ये सारे 193 नेशन जो है वो सब एक समान है. जियोग्राफिकली कोई नेशन बहुत बड़ा है या फिर इकोनॉमिकली स्ट्रांग है या फिर किसी एक पर्टिकुलर देश की मिलिट्री बहुत ही भारी है, उसकी मिलिट्री पावर बहुत ज़्यादा है, तो उसे वहाँ पर स्टेटस कुछ ज़्यादा मिलेगा, ऐसा नहीं है. ऑल मेंबर नेशंस विल हैव द सेम स्टेटस. All member nations of the United Nations should respect of what? Respect the freedom and geographical unity of other member nations. All member nations should solve their international disputes and any kind of mutual problem, or mutually they have to solve the problem. And now the important thing about the United Nations to understand is that the structure of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter describes the structure and functioning of the organization, how it works or how it functions. So the United Nations has 6 main organs, and in that the first one, General Assembly, then the Security Council, third one, Economic and Social Council, International Court of Justice, fourth one, fifth, Trusteeship Council, and the sixth one, Secretariat. So these are the 6 main organs of the United Nations: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, International Court of Justice, Trusteeship Council, and Secretariat. Now, one by one, we'll discuss about the each and every organ of the United Nations, its nature and how it works, or the functions of the particular organs. And now in this, the first one, General Assembly. All the member countries are members of the General Assembly. It means that 193 members are there in the General Assembly. Every year, the General Assembly meets in its session from September to December. Position and status of all the countries, whether they are rich or poor, big or small, is the same. And during the session, the General Assembly discusses important issues, Now, important issues like environment, disarmament, the decisions in the General Assembly are taken by majority. Important thing, kind of democracy is there in the United Nations. The decisions in the General Assembly are taken by majority, and these decisions are in the form of resolutions, not in the form of laws. Or in other words, we can say the General Assembly only passes resolutions, it does not make laws. जैसे हमने सिविक्स में पढ़ा है कि सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट में जब हमारी संसद में कुछ होता है, उसको लॉ पास करना होता है, तो डिस्कशन के बाद वो लॉ में कन्वर्ट हो जाता है आफ्टर साइनिंग ऑफ द प्रेसिडेंट एंड ऑल दैट. लेकिन यहाँ पर इन द यूनाइटेड नेशंस जनरल असेंबली किसी बात पर जब डिस्कशन होता है, मेजॉरिटी के तहत कोई डिसीजन लिया जाता है, तो वो डिसीजन लॉ नहीं होता है, इट्स रिजोल्यूशंस कि ऐसा हमें करना है. The significance of the General Assembly lies in the being a platform for representatives of member nations to come together and discuss and make policy. So three things are here. One is to come together, एक साथ आना है, एक साथ बैठना है. Then discussion. These things are very important in solving problems, and then to make policy or decision. आप भी देखो, कभी दो दोस्तों में अगर झगड़े होते हैं और हमें ऐसे लगता है कि उनके झगड़े सॉल्व होना चाहिए, तो पहले हम क्या करते हैं, उन्हें इकट्ठा लाना पड़ता है, फिर उस पर हम डिस्कस करते हैं और फिर हम डिसाइड करते हैं कि आज से इनकी दुश्मनी ख़त्म, दोस्ती शुरू. इट इज़ लाइक दैट. यहाँ पर ऐसा नहीं है कि हर बार वही होता है, बट इफ़ देयर इज़ एनी डिस्प्यूट और प्रॉब्लम इन द नेशंस, तो सारे एक साथ आते हैं, बैठते हैं, डिस्कस करते हैं और उस पर एक विचार करके एक पॉलिसी बनाई जाती है. Now the functions of General Assembly: to elect the non-permanent members of the Security Council, to choose the United Nations Secretary General and the judges of the International Court of Justice, about which we are going to talk, to pass the annual budget of the United Nations. These are the basic or important functions of General Assembly. To oversee the budget of the United Nations, appoint the non-permanent members to the Security Council, receive reports from other part of the United Nations, and make recommendations in the form of General Assembly resolutions. Next one now, Security Council. Security Council, which is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. It is in the name only. Security Council, responsible for maintaining international peace and security. If we talk about the composition of the Security Council, then the 5 permanent members are there and 10 which are non-permanent members. In the non-permanent members, which are chosen every 2 years by the General Assembly, and if we talk about the permanent members, then America, Russia, England, France and China are permanent members, and its head rotates between members. Now how it works: makes binding decisions about international disputes, recommend mediations, send peacekeeping missions, impose economic sanctions and arms embargoes. Decisions must be passed by 9 by 15 members and all of the 5 permanent members. Now here, one thing which is very important, a negative vote, or it is called veto, also known as the rule of great power unanimity, by a permanent member prevents adoption of a proposal. It means that for any decision to be taken, the assent of all 5 permanent members and 4 non-permanent members is necessary. It means altogether 9, 5 permanent and 4 non-permanent. But if even one of the 5 permanent member uses his veto, that is gives a negative vote, the decision cannot be taken. Now try to understand here. These 5 permanent members, these 10 non-permanent member. अब अगर कोई डिसीजन लेना है तो ये 5 में से 5 हमें चाहिए और 10 में से 4 चाहिए, तो ये हो गए 9 मेंबर्स. अब इस 5 में से किसी एक ने भी अपने वेटो पावर का यूज़ किया, निगेटिव वोट दिया, तो वो डिसीजन नहीं लिया जाता है. दिस इज व्हाट इज कॉल्ड वेटो पावर. देन द नेक्स्ट वन, द इंटरनेशनल कोर्ट ऑफ जस्टिस. International Court of Justice means the judicial branch of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice is located at The Hague in the Netherlands. There are 15 judges. How many? 15 judges in the International Court of Justice, and they are chosen by the General Assembly and the Security Council. Every judge has tenure of 9 years. So its main function, which are to settle legal disputes submitted to it by states and to provide advisory opinion on legal questions submitted to it by duly authorized international organs, agencies and the UN General Assembly. If we talk about its functions, then to interrupt international law authentically, to advise the various organs or subsidiary bodies of the United Nations about legal issues. Then the next thing, the secretariat. It provides studies, information and facilities needed by United Nations bodies for their meetings. Kind of documentation we can say, or the research. It also carries out tasks as directed by the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Economic and Social Council and other United Nations bodies. Now if we talk about the composition of the secretariat, the United Nations Secretariat is headed by the Secretary General, assisted by staff international civic servants worldwide. Each United Nations member country is enjoined to respect the international character of the Secretariat and not seek to influence its staff. The Secretary General alone is responsible for staff selection. Next one, in the organs of the United Nations, agencies of United Nations, if we talk, there are approximately 60 agencies of United Nations which works in different fields. Of them, there are 7 specialized agencies, which includes Food and Agricultural Organization, International Labour Organization, International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, that is UNESCO, United Nations Children's Fund, that is UNICEF, World Bank, World Health Organization. United Nations ECOSOC. It is responsible for coordinating the economic, social and related work of 14 United Nations specialized agencies, their functional commissions and 5 regional commissions. Economic and Social Council. They are selected by the General Assembly and each member has a tenure of 3 years, and each year 1/3 of the members are newly chosen. Decisions are taken by majority vote. Now if we talk about the functions of the Economic and Social Council, then initiate discussions at the global level on issues like poverty in the different parts of the world, unemployment, second important thing, economic and social inequality, and suggest policies to tackle these problems. So here one thing which is important again, it economic and social council not only discuss about the problem, but it also suggests the solution that how to solve the problem. Discuss issues like women's questions, empowerment of women, human rights, fundamental freedoms, global trade, health related issues, and make decisions on these issues. Make efforts to establish cultural and educational cooperation at the international level. Coordinate the functioning of the different organizations working in association with the United Nations. Now the next thing, the trustship of council. After the Second World War, the territories that were undeveloped after Second World War, territories that were undeveloped were placed under the responsibility of the developed nations. Try to understand this again. जो undeveloped टेरिटरीज है या फिर कंट्रीज है, उनकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज पे डाल दी. द लैटर वाज सपोज टू हेल्प bring about the development of the trust territories, and once they attain independence from the colonies, help establish democracy. So the work of the trustship council is over as there are no trust territories left. Then the Millennium Development Goals. The United Nations member nations came together in 2000 and decided upon the development goals for the new millennium, and in that the first one, to eliminate poverty and hunger which is in the different parts of the world, to make the facilities of primary education available all over the world, to bring about women's empowerment, reduce infant mortality rate, to take special care of the health of pregnant women, to fight diseases like AIDS, malaria, etc. Nowadays we can add COVID-19 in this. To protect the environment and increase the cooperation between developed and developing countries. Now, by these goals, one can understand easily that the United Nations not only work on any particular field or in any particular area, but it works for the betterment of the world. Then India has made considerable progress in the direction of achieving the Millennium Development Goals with the help of UNICEF and UNESCO. The United Nations created UNICEF in 1946. It was established to promote the rights of children throughout the world. UNICEF stands for the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. The organization works around the world helping children, and it also works to promote the rights of children throughout the world. So basically UNICEF is for the children. Then the next one, UNESCO, which is another affiliated organization of the United Nations, which works towards peace and security between, or we can say it works towards peace and security in the world by promoting cooperation between member countries in the fields of education, science and culture. Now the next point, United Nations and preservation of peace. To settle international conflict peacefully. Again the same thing, it is very important to solve or to settle the conflict peacefully, क्योंकि अगर वो peacefully settle नहीं हुए तो फिर से पूरी दुनिया अलग अलग हिस्सों में बट जाएगी, अलग अलग ग्रुप में बट जाएगी, जैसे फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वार और सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वार में हुआ था, और फिर वर्ल्ड वार होने के चांसेस होते हैं. सो इट इज़ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टू सेटल इंटरनेशनल कॉन्फ्लिक्ट peacefully. It includes appointing an intermediary acceptable to the nations involved in the conflict, use the legal procedure, appoint an arbitrator to solve the dispute, and if needed, to take recourse to military means and ensure that conflict will not occur again. United Nations makes efforts to ensure that violence does not erupt. Violence does not erupt in strike torn areas, and monarchy is restored as soon as possible. Next thing now, United Nations peacekeeping and preservation of peace. Prevention of conflict and mediation actually establish peace, not on the paper. Implement the measures of protecting peace and peace building. So the peacekeeping activity of the United Nations involve creating appropriate circumstances favorable for bringing about permanent peace in strife-torn areas. Now the next and the last point of the topic, the United Nations and India. India had participated in the different conferences that were held before the establishment of the United Nations. यूनाइटेड नेशन इस्टेब्लिश होने के पहले से ही इंडियन रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स वर देयर इन द डिस्कशन. India had participated in bringing issues like decolonization, disarmament, racial segregation on the United Nations platform. In 1946, India was the first country to raise the question of racism in the United Nations. India has always led the discussions about the problems of undeveloped and developing countries. India has always sent her troops to participate in the United Nations peacekeeping forces. So it is evident from the foregoing analysis that India makes serious efforts to solve international conflicts by peaceful means, and at international level our country is also known for the peace. So this was all about the United Nations, its structure, its objective, its principle, and its role in securing peace.
Please subscribe the channel and press bell icon to get notifications.
So my dear students, this is all for today. Thank you very much. Stay home, stay safe, take care.